The Prince and the Promise. The clang of wooden swords echoed off the stone walls of Targovist Castle. Young Vlad, barely a man, parried a feigned blow from his instructor, a grin stretching across his dust-streaked face. His movements, though still unrefined, held a raw intensity, a fierce determination that belied his age. Through an archway, he caught a glimpse of his father, Vlad II Dracula, his brow furrowed in concentration, leaning over a map spread across a heavy oak table. Voices, low and urgent, carried faintly, punctuated by the clatter. Shadows of the Ottoman. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and distant fear. Anka, barely taller than the loom her mother worked, paused in her chore of gathering kindling, her small hands still. The distant thrum of hooves had grown steadily louder, a discordant rhythm against the quiet pulse of the village. Not the familiar clatter of Wallachian patrols, but something heavier, more deliberate. Old Grigor, his back a permanent curve from decades in the fields, straightened slowly beside the village well, his gaze fixed on the dirt road winding from the south. His weathered face, usually impassive, now held a flicker of grim recognition. Ottomans, he grunted, the single word a chilling pronouncement. They come for their tribute. A collective intake of breath swept through the small gathering of villagers. Tribute was not merely grain or coin. Sometimes it was blood. Sometimes it was children. The fear was a tangible thing, a cold tendril snaking through the quiet lanes. At the castle, the demand was delivered with an arrogant flourish of silk and steel. Ottoman envoys, resplendent in their foreign finery, stood before Vlad Dracula, their pronouncements translated by a trembling scribe. The Sultan desired a gesture of loyalty, an assurance of Wallachia's continued subservience. He desired Vlad's two youngest sons, Vlad and Radu, to be raised in the imperial court, to learn the ways of the Ottomans. To serve as hostages. The air in the great hall grew thick with unspoken fury. Vlad Dracula, a man whose temper was legendary, stood rigid, his jaw clenched. But defiance meant war, and Wallachia, exhausted from years of conflict, could not withstand the full might of the Ottoman war machine. The choice was no choice at all. Anka watched from the edge of the crowd that gathered along the road leading from the castle. The village, usually bustling with activity, had fallen silent, its inhabitants drawn by an unseen magnet. The gate creaked open, and two small figures emerged, dwarfed by the imposing guards that flanked them. Vlad, no older than Anka herself, walked with a stiff, unnatural posture, his small hand clutched in Radu's. Radu, younger still, clung to his brother, his face streaked with tears that mirrored the silent anguish on his mother's face, as she stood beside her husband, her eyes swollen and red. Vlad looked back once, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces, over the rolling hills of Wallachia, a desperate final farewell. Anka saw the raw terror in his eyes, the dawning comprehension of the vast, unknown world swallowing him whole. It was a look that imprinted itself on her memory, a silent scream of a child torn from everything he knew. Old Grigor stood beside Anka, his gnarled hands gripping a worn wooden staff. "Another generation," he muttered, his voice raspy with sorrow. "Another sacrifice to the Turk. It never ends." He shook his head, a deep, weary sigh escaping him. "May God have mercy on their souls, for the Sultan will have none." The column moved slowly, the Ottoman soldiers impassive, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that obscured the departing boys. Vlad and Radu, two small figures swallowed by the vastness of the empire's will, were gone. A collective shudder rippled through the villagers. The sun, once bright and reassuring, now seemed to cast longer, darker shadows across the land. A shadow, Anka realized with a chill, that would not lift for a very long time. Lessons in darkness. The scent of sweat and fear was a constant companion in the Ottoman training grounds. Years bled into one another, marked by the unforgiving rhythm of a whip on flesh and the clang of steel. Vlad, no longer a child, moved with a controlled ferocity that belied his age. Each morning, before the first call to prayer, he was pushed to his limits, his body becoming a weapon. He learned to wield a scimitar with deadly precision, to ride a warhorse into a simulated charge. to endure hunger and thirst with stoic resolve. He watched, too, as men who faltered, men who showed weakness were summarily executed, their screams abruptly silenced, their bodies left as stark warnings. These sights, rather than breaking him, forged an unyielding core of resilience. He saw the power in absolute, unquestioning obedience, the brutal efficiency of a system built on fear. He became a shadow, observing beyond the confines of his own training. During tactical drills, when the Janissaries practiced their formations, Vlad would linger at the edges of the courtyard, ostensibly fetching water or cleaning equipment. His eyes, sharp and calculating, absorbed every detail: the synchronized movements of the archers, the disciplined advance of the infantry, the strategic deployment of cavalry. He noted the precise commands, the intricate signals, the unflinching loyalty of the elite troops to their commanders. He saw in their rigid structure, not just power, but control, a perfect, terrifying machine. He understood, then, that true authority lay not just in brute force, but in an unwavering grip on every single component, every single man. Radu, however, found a different path within the labyrinthine Ottoman court. While Vlad honed his martial skills and plotted his silent observations, Radu cultivated a different kind of strength. His gentle demeanor and striking good looks, once a source of vulnerability, became his greatest assets. He learned the subtle art of diplomacy, the intricate dance of courtly intrigue. He charmed viziers with his wit, endeared himself to the sultan's wives with his poetic verses, and even garnered the occasional indulgent smile from Sultan Murad himself. He was often seen in silken robes, attending scholarly discussions or musical performances, a stark contrast to Vlad's calloused hands and grim countenance. This divergence created a chasm between the brothers that widened with each passing season. Their shared childhood, their common plight, began to feel like a distant memory. Vlad saw Radu's adaptability as weakness, a betrayal of their heritage, a surrender to their captors. Radu, in turn, viewed Vlad's brooding intensity as a dangerous, self-destructive path. Their conversations grew sparse, laden with unspoken resentments. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training, Vlad found Radu laughing with a group of Ottoman nobles. Their eyes met across the torchlit courtyard, and in Radu's gaze, Vlad saw not camaraderie, but a chilling acceptance of his gilded cage. In that moment, the last vestiges of their fraternal bond shattered, replaced by a cold, hard understanding that their destinies, forged in the fires of Ottoman captivity, would be irrevocably separate. Vlad knew then that his path, scarred by darkness, and fueled by a burning need for dominion, would be walked alone. Return to a broken land. The familiar scent of damp earth and pine, once a comfort, now carried an acrid undercurrent of decay. Vlad rode alone, the gaunt flanks of his borrowed horse a mirror to the land he traversed. The roads, once merely uneven, were now rutted chasms, testament to neglect, and the heavy passage of invaders. Villages he remembered as bustling hamlets stood as skeletal remains, their timbers blackened by fire, their fields choked with weeds. Smoke, when he saw it, was thin and hesitant, not the robust plumes of thriving hearths. Wallachia, his Wallachia, had bled. He passed a broken crucifix, its wooden arms snapped at the elbows, lying half-buried in the mud. The sight, a stark blasphemy, settled a cold weight in his stomach. He was no stranger to brutality, but this was a different kind of wound, a slow, festering gangrene that ate at the very soul of the land. The air, usually crisp with the promise of autumn, felt heavy, as if burdened by a collective sigh of despair. It was late evening when he reached the ruins of Targovista. The outer palisade was a splintered mess, the main gate hanging by a single hinge, groaning softly in the wind, like a dying man's last breath. Within the courtyard a few figures moved, stooped and listless. One, a man whose frame was both familiar and startlingly diminished, turned at the sound of hooves. Old Grigor. His face, once lined with the wisdom of a seasoned oak, was now a map of sorrow, etched with deeper valleys around his eyes, which, though weary, still held a spark of his old fire. His beard, whiter than Vlad remembered, seemed to hang heavier. "Vlad?" Grigor rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He made no move to bow, only stared, as if seeing a ghost. "Grigor," Vlad returned, dismounting. The old man's gaze swept over him, appraising the lean, hard lines of his body, the unwavering intensity in his eyes. "You've returned," Grigor said, the words a statement of fact, devoid of welcome or joy. "To a Wallachia you will not recognize." He led Vlad to a small, overgrown plot behind the hastily repaired chapel. 2 mounds of freshly turned earth, marked by simple wooden crosses, stood stark against the dying light. The names, roughly carved, chilled Vlad to the bone. Mircea. Vlad II Dracula. "The Turks they came," Grigor began, his voice flat. "Radu was with them. They put Mircea to the sword, here in the courtyard. Your father, he was betrayed by the boyars, abandoned, hunted like a common cur. They caught him near Balteni. His head was sent to the Sultan. Radu wears a Turk's turban now." Vlad stood over the graves, a silent sentinel. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a mournful dirge. His father, the dragon, reduced to a headless corpse. His brother, Mircea, cut down like a dog, and Radu, his younger brother, a traitor, a pawn of the enemy. The implications were a suffocating weight. Wallachia, broken by infighting, by betrayal, by the creeping shadow of the Ottoman Empire. He clenched his fists, knuckles white. The bitterness of exile, the humiliation of his captivity, coalesced into a cold, burning resolve. This was not the Wallachia he remembered. But it would be the Wallachia he rebuilt. He would reclaim his birthright, not just for himself, but for the very soul of the land. He would scour the rot, purge the weakness, and forge a nation hardened by fire, capable of standing against any storm. The cost, he knew, would be immense, but the alternative, a Wallachia lost to the dust of history, was unthinkable. He would make them strong again, no matter how much blood had to be shed. The Impaler's justice. An unsettling quiet settled over Targoviste, a heavy blanket stifling any hint of celebration. No bells tolled in joy, no festive shouts pierced the somber air. Vlad's coronation unfolded as a grim declaration, far removed from any jubilant spectacle. He stood on the raised dais, a weighty gold crown resting on his dark hair, his face a chiseled mask of stone. Yet his eyes, alight with an unyielding, frigid intensity, promised not peace, but a radical transformation. Anka, a small figure lost in the throng of common folk near the palace courtyard, shivered, despite the midday sun. This was not the benevolent monarch of her dreams, the healer Wallachia desperately needed. This was something altogether different. The true character of Vlad's rule materialized with terrifying speed. Within days, rumors, insidious as creeping poison, circulated about a swift, savage justice awaiting any who dared challenge his authority. Soon, these whispers congealed into a grotesque reality. Anka stood in the market square, clutching a basket of fresh eggs, when the first procession lumbered into view. Cart after cart creaked into the square, not laden with wares, but with men, bound and helpless. Boyars, their once silken robes now tattered and stained, their faces bleached with terror, were roughly pulled from the vehicles. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the first stake was driven into the earth. A thick, sharpened timber, taller than any man. A cold dread seeped into Anka's bones, her breath snagging in her throat. She watched, transfixed by horror, as a boyar, a man whose opulent estate she had once admired from afar, was forced onto the impaling stake. His screams, raw and piercing, ripped through the oppressive silence, ricocheting off the cobblestones. The method was excruciatingly slow, the stake's insidious ascent through the body, an agonizing testament to cruelty. Anka's stomach twisted, and she clamped her teeth together to stifle a cry. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that this was Vlad's definitive justice. Old Grigor stood nearby, his usually stern features etched with profound sorrow. He observed the macabre spectacle, his eyes narrowed, but without the overt terror that gripped many. Wallachia's brutal history had hardened him to cruelty, yet this particular horror surpassed anything he had witnessed. He grasped the logic, the stark message Vlad intended for potential dissidents. These boyars, he understood, had been vultures, picking at Wallachia's carcass, trading loyalty for coin. Yet the method, it was barbaric, a horror whispered only in tales of ancient tyrants. His gaze met Anka's across the square for a fleeting moment. In his eyes, she saw not just revulsion, but a deep, weary comprehension of the dark path Wallachia had now embarked upon. He knew this was Vlad's chosen way to forge a new order, but at what cost to their very souls? The screams continued, a gruesome symphony of agony, a chilling testament to the Impaler's reign. The air, once merely quiet, now vibrated with the palpable fear of a broken people. Whispers of terror. The cold wind carried more than just the scent of pine and damp earth these days. It brought whispers, hushed and hurried, that snaked through the village like tendrils of smoke. Anka, kneading dough by the hearth, felt the hairs prickle on her arms as she strained to catch fragments. Vlad, Impaler, Fear, old Grigor, nursing a cup of weak tea, grumbled. They arrived with their turbans high, and their noses even higher. Ottoman dogs, thinking our prince a lesser man. He spat into the fire, the crackle a punctuation mark to his disdain. Demanded audience, refused to remove their hats. Disrespectful cur. In our lands. Anka remembered the arrival of the foreign delegation, their silken robes a stark contrast to the rough wool of the villagers. They had ridden with an arrogant swagger, their laughter echoing a little too loudly through the quiet streets. Old Grigor continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that still carried a tremor of awe. Vlad welcomed them, offered them supper. A fine meal, I heard. Then, when the matter of their headwear arose again, he simply asked if they were so devoted to their traditions, perhaps their hats should be permanently affixed. Anka's hands stilled, dough sticking to her fingers, permanently affixed. A chill spread through her. She knew Vlad's temper, his iron will, but this felt different. Grigor sighed, rubbing a calloused hand over his beard. He had them nailed, their turbans, to their skulls. The screams, they say, could be heard for miles. A gasp escaped Anka's lips. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the taste of fear, sudden and bitter. The disrespect, she understood, but the swift, brutal reprisal, the sheer inventiveness of the cruelty, sent a shiver deep into her bones. This wasn't just justice, it was a demonstration. A warning etched in blood. Later that week, more whispers reached her, carried by nervous women at the communal well. Vlad had summoned the poor, the beggars, the ailing from all corners of Wallachia. A great feast, they said, a promise of charity and warmth in the biting cold. Anka, drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress, ventured to the edge of the marketplace. From behind a thick oak tree she peered out. Indeed, a grand tent had been erected, its canvas flapping in the wind. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and pitchers of wine. Hundreds of the downtrodden, their faces etched with hunger and hope, crammed inside. Their joyous shouts and the clatter of plates reached her, momentarily masking the growing unease in her stomach. Then, Vlad himself appeared, his dark eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd. He spoke, his voice carrying surprising clarity in the din. Anka couldn't make out the exact words, but she saw the faces of the beggars turn from confusion to dawning horror. A moment later, guards emerged, not with more food, but with torches. They began to seal the exits of the tent, pouring oil along the base. The smell of smoke hit Anka first, acrid and sickening. Then, the screams began. Not joyous shouts, but the shrieks of terror, of human beings realizing their fate. The tent, a beacon of false hope, became a roaring inferno. The heat, even from her distance, was intense, singeing the leaves on the oak tree. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh, a smell that would forever cling to her memory. Anka stumbled back, gagging, tears streaming down her face. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the horrific symphony, but it was useless. The echoes resonated deep within her, a chilling testament to Vlad's chilling message. Wallachia would be rid of its burdens, by any means necessary. The whispers of terror had coalesced into a roaring blaze. The forest of the dead. The courier, a young man whose horse looked near collapse, stumbled into the courtyard, breath coming in ragged gasps. News, grim and swift, followed him like a shadow. Ottoman host advancing from the south, thousands. The words, though spoken to the prince's guard, echoed through the stone halls, finding Anka as she polished a candelabra in the great hall. Her hand faltered, the silver cloth dropping to the floor. The air, already thick with the scent of beeswax and old timber, suddenly felt charged with an electric dread. In her village, miles from the fortress, old Grigor heard the same tidings from a rider, less hurried but equally burdened. He stood by the communal well, his face a roadmap of Wallachian winters. "They come again," he muttered, his voice raspy, like locusts, year after year. A young mother clutched her child tighter, her eyes wide with a fear Anka knew well. Grigor looked at the distant hills, already imagining the dust clouds that would soon mar the horizon. He knew what Vlad would do. He always did. Vlad, however, showed no fear, only a chilling resolve. Seated at his rough-hewn table, a map spread before him, his fingers traced the predicted advance. His eyes, usually pools of simmering anger, now held a cold, unwavering focus. "Let them come," he rasped, the words a low growl. "They seek to conquer Wallachia? They will find only death." His fist slammed the table, rattling the pewter tankard beside him. "Summon the captains, the stakes, prepare them. Thousands, more than ever before. Let every man, woman, and child who remains in their path be harvested." The last word was uttered with a grim finality that sent a shiver down the spine of the scribe taking his dictation. Anka, hidden behind a tapestry, heard the pronouncement. The methodical horror of it made her stomach clench. Days later, the Ottoman scout, a seasoned veteran named Malik, led his small detachment through a dense forest of oak and beech. The air, usually alive with birdsong, was eerily silent. A strange metallic scent, like rust and something else unidentifiable, hung heavy. He signaled his men to halt, raising a hand. A cold dread began to prickle his skin. Then, through the thinning trees he saw them. Thousands of them. Not trees, but men, women, and children, impaled on sharpened stakes. Their bodies, grotesque and distended, pointed towards the sky like a ghastly harvest. Some were still clothed, their garments tattered flags in the windless air. Others were stripped bare, their skin taut and discolored. A baby, barely more than an infant, was nailed to its mother's chest, both impaled on a single, massive stake. The scene stretched for miles, a silent, terrible testament to a will so utterly devoid of mercy, it defied human comprehension. Malik's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He had seen battlefields soaked in blood, cities put to the torch. But this was an art form of terror. It was a message etched in flesh, screaming a warning louder than any trumpet. His men, hardened soldiers, turned away, some retching into the undergrowth. The forest, once a place of natural beauty, was now the very definition of hell. He turned his horse, his face pale and clammy. "Retreat." There was no other word. "Turn back," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell the Sultan. Tell him Wallachia is guarded by the devil himself." The Ottoman army, upon hearing Malik's report and seeing the first horrifying glimpses of the forest, a legacy of fear and freedom. The years under Vlad's iron fist had sculpted Wallachia into a land of stark contrasts. Fields, once fallow, now yielded bountiful harvests, the threat of Ottoman raids a distant whisper. Roads, once perilous with bandits, were clear and safe, a testament to the prince's brutal justice. Yet, the prosperity was a gilded cage, its bars forged from fear. The air, though often sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth, always carried a faint, metallic tang of dread, a reminder of the thousands who had met their end on the sharpened stakes outside Targoviste. Anka's family had found a fragile peace in this new order. Their small farm, nestled on the outskirts of a thriving village, hummed with activity. Her brother, too young to remember the chaos before Vlad, knew only this strange stability. Anka, however, remembered the tales her grandmother whispered by the firelight, tales of Ottoman horsemen and Wallachian lords who cared little for the common folk. Vlad had changed that. He cared, in his own terrifying way. He protected them. But the price for that protection was absolute obedience and the constant, gnawing awareness of his swift, merciless hand. One crisp autumn afternoon, Anka sat with old Grigor on a weathered bench outside his cottage. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of drying herbs. Grigor, his face a roadmap of ancient sorrows, stared out at the bustling village square. Children played, their laughter bright and unburdened, a sound that had been rare in Wallachia not so long ago. "Look at them," Anka murmured, a quiet awe in her voice. "They are safe, they are fed." Grigor grunted, a sound like stones grinding together. "Safe, yes. Fed, yes. But at what cost, little sparrow? Every loaf of bread, every safe night's sleep, it's bought with blood. With screams. With the silence of 1,000 families who dared to displease him." He ran a gnarled hand over his bristly chin. He made Wallachia strong. Strong enough to stand against the Turk for now. But he made us strong through terror, not through love. What kind of legacy is that? Anka plucked at a loose thread on her simple wool skirt. "But the bandits, the corruption, it is gone. Our carts travel unmolested to the market. The merchants pay fair prices. Is that not good?" "Good for the living, perhaps," Grigor conceded, his gaze fixed on a distant, ominous-looking raven circling high above. "But the dead do not enjoy fair prices. The impaled do not celebrate safe roads. He carved order from chaos, true. But he used a butcher's knife, not a sculptor's chisel. And the scars will remain long after he is gone. What will grow from such soil, Anka? Will freedom truly bloom where it has been watered with so much fear?" Anka shivered, despite the mild sun. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. She saw the peace, felt the security, but in Grigor's eyes, she saw the shadow that always accompanied Vlad's reign. A shadow that promised to linger, a chilling legacy that might forever bind Wallachia to both its savior and its tormentor. The legend lives on. The wind, a bitter whisper from the Carpathian peaks, carried the scent of wood smoke and a chill that seeped into Anka's bones. It had been years since the last impalement, years since the terror of Vlad's reign had reached its peak, yet a different kind of unease now settled over Wallachia. Rumors, like tendrils of fog, snaked through the villages. He was dead, some whispered, felled by a Turkish blade in a skirmish near Bucharest. No, others insisted, betrayed by his own boyars, ambushed in the dense forests he knew so well. Still others swore he had simply vanished, a shadow swallowed by the night, destined to return. Anka, her hands calloused from years of toil, stirred the meager stew over the hearth fire. Her two youngest, Ionut and Maria, huddled near the flames, their eyes wide and bright. Around them, other children from the village sat, their small voices hushed, captivated by the tale old Grigor was spinning. He sat on a low stool, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his voice a gravelly murmur that commanded attention. "They say," Grigor began, his gaze sweeping over the rapt faces, "that even in death, his eyes remained open. Staring, watching." He paused, letting the silence stretch, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a wolf. "No one saw him buried." "Not truly. A few men, cloaked in darkness, carried something away. But what it was, a body, or just the idea of him." Maria, usually so boisterous, clutched her brother's arm. "Why, Grigor? Why did he do such terrible things?" Old Grigor sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of memory. "He believed it was the only way, child. To forge Wallachia into something strong, something untouchable. He painted the land with fear, yes, but for a time, that fear kept the wolves at bay. The Turks, they learned to tremble at the mention of his name." He glanced towards Anka, a silent acknowledgement of the lingering shadow Vlad had cast. Anka met his gaze, a knot of old fear tightening in her stomach. She remembered the impaled, the silent testament to his will. The sight had never left her. Ionut, bolder than his sister, piped up. "My father says he was a hero, that he saved us from the Ottomans." Grigor's lips thinned. A hero, perhaps, but one forged in fire and blood. He achieved a terrifying peace, but at what cost to our souls? The land still remembers the screams, the forests still whisper his name. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial tone. Even after his supposed death, the stories grew. Of a creature of the night, drawing strength from the very soil he defended. A lord who commanded the beasts of the forest, whose touch brought a chill colder than any winter wind. The children shivered collectively, pulling their knees closer to their chests. Anka watched them, her heart aching with a familiar fear. She knew these stories weren't just tales, they were the echoes of a very real terror, a history that had scarred her people. Old Grigor looked into the embers, his eyes distant. He instilled such a profound fear that it became more than just a memory, it became a legend. A shadow that crept into the minds of men, transforming into something monstrous, something otherworldly. He finally met Anka's gaze again, a solemn understanding passing between them. The world beyond Wallachia heard these whispers, these dark accounts of a prince who dined among the dying, who found pleasure in the suffering of his enemies. They heard of his unholy strength, his unyielding will, his thirst for justice that morphed into an insatiable hunger. Anka knew what he meant. The stories, embellished and exaggerated with each retelling, would eventually find their way into the hands of a writer, a curious mind seeking inspiration in the darkest corners of history. And there, in the chilling exploits of Vlad the Impaler, they would find the genesis of a creature of unimaginable terror, a nobleman of the night, forever bound to the blood-soaked legacy of Wallachia, Count Dracula. The legend, born from the prince's brutal reality, had only just begun to truly live.